On the morning of August 17, 1944, 73 captured German women arrived under military escort at Camp Swift, Texas. Their convoy moved slowly along a dust-choked road bordered by mesquite trees, sunlight piercing through gaps in the barbed wire perimeter glinting across newly painted guard towers. Most of them were nurses and auxiliaries taken during the Allied advance through northern France, their uniforms tattered, their pride still unbroken. The women had been warned that Americans were brutal savages, that captivity meant humiliation and violence beyond imagination. Yet as the trucks halted near the administrative compound, they saw not bayonets, but soldiers carrying clipboards, speaking calmly through interpreters, their posture disciplined yet strangely humane. The camp itself spread across nearly 2,000 acres of fenced prairie, a self-contained world of barracks, kitchens, infirmaries and mess halls built with practical Texan efficiency. Above each wooden structure fluttered the stars and stripes, a symbol the prisoners viewed with equal parts hatred and fear. They expected punishment, deprivation, and the slow erosion of dignity under enemy command. Instead, a quiet order defined every movement of the American guards, whose behavior seemed governed not by cruelty, but by procedure. Even this unfamiliar restraint unsettled the prisoners, for it contradicted every warning whispered during their capture. Among them walked Nurse Ilse Reinhardt, a 27-year-old field medic who had served in Normandy before her evacuation failed. Hardened by battlefield suffering, she held her head high, determined not to appear broken before the victors. Yet beneath her defiance flickered confusion as she observed camp workers cleaning the mess hall windows, polishing silverware, and preparing what appeared to be an organized breakfast. The scent of smoke drifted from iron stoves, mingling with something alien and rich, bacon sizzling in deep pans, eggs cracking in rhythmic precision. For the prisoners, that smell carried disbelief. It defied their expectations of cruelty, mocking every fear they had nurtured during capture. When the guards announced breakfast, silence fell like an unseen verdict. No interrogation followed, no punishment commenced. Instead, plates were set before them, real food, served with measured dignity. Within those first bewildering moments, the foundations of indoctrination began to tremble quietly, and none among them yet understood how deeply one meal would challenge everything they believed about themselves and their enemies. Inside the mess hall of Camp Swift, light filtered through canvas blinds, cutting the morning haze into soft amber beams. The German women entered cautiously, their boots scraping across the polished wooden floor as the hum of conversation rose around them. Long tables stretched across the room, lined with tin plates, utensils and pitchers of water, reflecting the golden glow from overhead bulbs. The American cooks, dressed in white aprons, moved efficiently behind serving stations, where the scent of bacon and fresh eggs filled the air. For the prisoners, this aroma carried shock, disbelief, and a quiet sense of unreality. Ilse Reinhardt hesitated at the front of the line, glancing toward a sergeant who gestured for her to step forward. She had endured air raids, field surgeries, and hunger during retreat from Normandy, but never had the simple sight of food unsettled her so profoundly. Each plate contained scrambled eggs, fried bacon, and buttered toast, a meal that, in wartime Germany, would have been unimaginable even for officers. The American guards did not mock or lecture them. Instead, they treated each prisoner with practiced normalcy, as though feeding enemies were routine. That calm, almost bureaucratic courtesy struck deeper than cruelty ever could, exposing a moral dissonance none had anticipated. As Ilse sat beside fellow prisoners, the first bites fell into a silence broken only by clinking utensils. The eggs were soft, rich with butter, and the bacon crisp, its salt cutting through the dull ache of memory. Several women blinked back tears before lowering their eyes, ashamed of the emotion rising unbidden from within. To taste something so generous while wearing the insignia of a defeated army was unbearable, yet undeniable. One nurse whispered a prayer of gratitude she did not fully understand, her voice trembling like glass beneath strain. By the meal's end, tension hung heavier than hunger. No one spoke openly, Yet every woman felt the same invisible fracture spreading through belief and identity. Indoctrination had promised them hatred, but reality offered compassion disguised as routine. Outside, the American flag stirred gently in the summer wind, its movement rhythmic, indifferent, and profoundly human. Beneath that silent symbol, 73 prisoners began an unspoken reckoning, one that would soon divide loyalty from conscience within the confines of Camp Swift's orderly fences. By the second week of captivity, Camp Swift had settled into a rhythm that confused the German women as much as it reassured them. Each morning began with roll call under the Texan sun, followed by work assignments that ranged from sewing uniforms to assisting medical staff at the infirmary. The guards maintained strict order, yet displayed a peculiar civility, addressing prisoners by rank, ensuring rations were fair, and allowing supervised correspondence. To many, this courtesy felt like deception, an elaborate trick designed to erode resistance through comfort. To others, particularly those exhausted by war's cruelty, it felt like awakening from a long collective delusion. Among the 73 women, divisions deepened swiftly. The ideological core, those loyal to National Socialism, formed a secretive circle they called Die Treuen, the Faithful. Their leader, Corporal Anneliese Brandt, had once served in a communications unit attached to the Waffen-SS and considered leniency a form of corruption. She delivered whispered lectures at night, warning that kindness was poison, that the Americans were softening them for exploitation. She kept lists of women she suspected of weakness, her watchful eyes transforming dormitory silence into quiet fear. Ilse Reinhardt noticed these shifts immediately, understanding how belief could weaponize despair. In contrast, another small group began questioning everything they had once accepted as truth. They spoke softly during work details, comparing propaganda with what they now witnessed daily: guards sharing cigarettes, medics treating German patients respectfully, and chaplains offering voluntary church services without discrimination. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Each act of decency pressed harder against the walls of ideology until they began to crack. For the first time, loyalty no longer seemed synonymous with honor. It began to resemble blindness. Ilse found herself between these factions, torn between duty to comrades and conscience awakened by compassion. The breakfast that had once seemed trivial now echoed in her thoughts as a quiet symbol of defiance against indoctrination. Every act of normal kindness from her captors forced her to reconsider who the enemy truly was. At night, she lay awake listening to crickets beyond the barracks, understanding that war's deepest prison was not physical confinement, but the fear of questioning what one has been taught to believe without proof. By late August 1944, the summer heat at Camp Swift thickened the air with dust and mesquite smoke, carrying the strange scent of grilled meat and freedom that unsettled its new inhabitants. Daily routines blurred into an uneasy peace. American officers enforced discipline with quiet authority, but the German women noticed something disarming in their restraint. No humiliation, no arbitrary cruelty, no shouting guards. Each meal remained plentiful. Each day followed the same rhythm of work, rest, and inspection. Yet beneath the stillness, tension coiled like wire, invisible but ready to snap. Corporal Anneliese Brandt and Die Treuen intensified their efforts to preserve ideological purity among the prisoners. They spread rumors that the breakfast food contained sedatives meant to weaken German resolve, that the Americans used comfort as a weapon sharper than any rifle. They painted Ilse Reinhardt and others who questioned such claims as traitors, whispering threats during roll calls, sabotaging chores, and writing coded letters meant for interception to signal loyalty to the Reich. Inside the camp's wire fences, another invisible war began, one not fought with weapons, but with ideas. Ilse, now assigned to assist in the infirmary, witnessed how differently American medics treated captured soldiers compared to the brutality she had seen inflicted upon Allied prisoners in Europe. Wounded Germans received anesthesia, clean bandages, and kind words. She helped dress wounds while Sergeant Thomas Heller, a former Texas ranch hand turned medic, spoke to her in slow, respectful English, explaining every step as though addressing an equal. His simple decency confounded her training. She had been told Americans were godless, greedy, incapable of honor, yet everything she saw contradicted it. The first small act of defiance came quietly. One evening, Ilse refused to participate in D. Troyen's night assembly. When Brandt demanded an explanation, Ilse replied that loyalty could not exist without truth. The barracks fell silent. That night, someone slashed her mattress and scattered her letters across the floor. She understood then that her real battle was no longer for survival. It was for moral clarity. The war outside the wire might rage across continents, but within Camp Swift, the struggle for redemption had already begun, carried on in whispers, in glances, and in the courage to doubt one's own past. The turning point arrived with a single envelope, creased and stained, bearing the postmark of Linz, Austria. It was delivered through Red Cross channels, addressed to Ilse Reinhardt, though its handwriting belonged unmistakably to her elder brother, Lieutenant Karl Reinhardt of the Waffen-SS. The camp censor had already opened and resealed it, but the words inside were untouched. Ilse read it under the dim barracks light, surrounded by murmurs of women mending uniforms and exchanging gossip about home. The first lines spoke affectionately, describing ration shortages and air raid sirens, yet halfway through the page, the tone shifted. Karl wrote of duties necessary for the preservation of Germany, tasks performed at a place called Mauthausen, and sentences that revealed truths no propaganda could conceal. Words like selection, labor re-education, and final orders froze the air around her. For the first time, Ilse confronted her family's proximity to horror. She had grown up believing Karl a soldier like any other, brave and loyal. Now, between the lines, she saw confessions disguised as justifications, atrocities cloaked in bureaucratic phrasing. Her hands trembled as she folded the letter, hiding it beneath her pillow before lights out. That night, the ceiling fan creaked above the silence of 73 uneasy souls, each prisoner trapped not just behind fences, but within the collapsing walls of their own convictions. Days later, rumors reached D. Troyen that Ilse had received correspondence from an officer linked to an SS camp. Brandt demanded she surrender it for inspection. Ilse refused. The confrontation spread through the dormitory like fire through dry grass. Some whispered that she protected classified information. Others suspected she concealed evidence of crimes. Even American guards noticed the sudden unrest. Major Robert Kent, the camp's commanding officer, summoned her for questioning, his voice steady, but his gaze sharp with recognition. He had seen letters like this before, letters that bridged the fragile boundary between denial and truth. When Ilse finally handed him the document, she expected interrogation. Instead, he read it silently, folded it carefully, and said only one sentence. Miss Reinhardt, history will need people brave enough to admit what really happened. For the first time, she realized the enemy's greatest weapon was not power, but mercy. September's dry wind carried the scent of mesquite and ash across Camp Swift as the mornings grew cooler, and with them came subtle but undeniable change. After the letter incident, Ilse Reinhardt was reassigned to assist in the camp's administrative office under supervision, officially due to her literacy in English, though everyone understood it was also a test of trust. Major Kent observed her quietly, noting how carefully she avoided propaganda discussions, how she recorded names and work assignments with quiet precision. Within the paperwork, she began to glimpse the scale of the American system, its order, transparency, and strange fairness. Nothing resembled the bureaucratic deceit she had witnessed under the Reich's shadow. Meanwhile, D. Troyen hardened their resistance. Brandt and her followers now held nightly meetings behind the laundry shed, plotting to reassert Nazi discipline through intimidation. Their goal was to silence Ilse and anyone who showed curiosity about American values.
They distributed hand-drawn swastikas, recited oaths, and planned coded messages to other camps, an embryonic conspiracy that American intelligence would later recognize as part of Operation Loyalty. Yet within the barracks, cracks widened. Younger auxiliaries, some barely 20, began skipping the secret meetings altogether, drawn instead to the laughter from the American canteen where country music played through open windows.
One afternoon, Ilse joined Sergeant Heller to inventory medical supplies. When he offered her a sandwich, she hesitated before accepting, taking a cautious bite. It was simple: white bread, smoked bacon, crisp lettuce. But she felt the strangeness of a meal shared without suspicion. For a moment she remembered breakfast on her first morning, the smell of fried eggs, the disbelief that kindness could exist without purpose. The memory now returned not as confusion, but as understanding. This quiet civility was not manipulation, it was strength. That evening she wrote in her diary, "They win not by hate but by humanity. That is why we lost." Outside, the guards' laughter mingled with cicadas, and for the first time, she did not hear her captors as enemies. She heard them as men and women who had chosen mercy where her own nation had chosen fear. And that realization, sharper than any bullet, marked the beginning of her transformation. By late October 1944, Camp Swift simmered with unseen tension as the remnants of Detroit prepared to reclaim their authority through violence. Their plan, smuggled in coded letters disguised as hymn verses, aimed to ignite coordinated unrest across several POW camps, an operation echoing the loyalty Hitler demanded even in captivity. Inside the women's barracks, whispers spread faster than the evening wind, but fear and silence kept most prisoners obedient. Ilse Reinhardt, however, had grown weary of silence. The letter from her old comrade in France, intercepted weeks earlier, had revealed enough to expose the larger network. Still, to speak meant death. Brandt's loyalists had already punished a young typist for merely questioning the cause. One night, Ilse approached Greta Fischer, the camp nurse who had once comforted new arrivals with small acts of kindness. Together, under the weak glow of a bare bulb, they debated whether to act. "If we stay quiet," Ilse whispered, "we become the same as them." Greta hesitated, torn between loyalty and conscience. Finally, she nodded, realizing that the ideology demanding silence had already destroyed everything it claimed to protect. The next morning, Ilse quietly requested an audience with Major Kent, handing him a folded page covered in coded German shorthand. His expression tightened as he read, then softened with something like respect. Within hours, American intelligence officers began discreet arrests, dismantling the conspiracy before it reached neighboring camps. Brandt's reaction was immediate and furious. She cornered Ilse outside the latrine, eyes burning with betrayal. "You've condemned your own people," she hissed, voice trembling with rage. Ilse, steady but pale, replied, "No, I've saved what's left of them." Guards intervened before the confrontation turned violent, and for the first time the symbol of the Reich seemed powerless beneath the Texas sun. That evening, an unexpected calm settled over Camp Swift. The American flag fluttered gently above the mess hall, where the scent of cornbread drifted through open doors. Ilse sat alone, watching the horizon fade from gold to violet. The camp still held fences, barbed wire, and rules, yet she felt something vast had changed within those boundaries. For the first time since the war began, she was not afraid of truth. In November 1944, the aftermath of the thwarted uprising left Camp Swift quieter, yet heavier with reflection and uncertainty. The ringleaders of Detroit had been separated for transfer to distant facilities, while those who remained faced an unexpected question of identity. Without Brandt's shadow ruling the barracks, silence no longer felt like safety, but emptiness. Ilse found herself summoned to the intelligence office once more, this time not as an informant, but as a translator for censored correspondence between prisoners and their families in Germany. With each letter, she glimpsed fragments of humanity, stripped bare by war, mothers writing about ruined homes, fathers pleading for forgiveness, and children describing bomb shelters as new playgrounds. The paper smelled faintly of ash, carrying the residue of a world disintegrating beyond the ocean. Among those letters lay one addressed to Greta Fischer, marked from Hanover, its envelope trembling in her hands. The handwriting was familiar, her brother, still stationed near Linz, describing unrest in the east and referencing special work, no longer hidden by euphemism. He spoke of orders carried out in silence, of trains and quotas, of names erased. Greta read in stillness, the words sinking like stones through her ribs. She folded the page once, twice, and handed it to Ilse without a word. Both women understood what it meant. The revelation of atrocity was no longer rumor or propaganda, it was family. That night, Greta wrote her reply under the dim light of a kerosene lamp. She wrote not as a loyal soldier, but as a sister stripped of illusion. "If you are still human," she wrote, "you must stop what you can, even if it means disobeying." When she sealed the envelope, her hands trembled, knowing it might never reach him, or worse, might condemn them both. Yet sending it felt like reclaiming her soul from the wreckage of obedience. Outside, frost crept across the barbed wire, glinting under a pale Texas moon. Somewhere beyond the horizon, bombers droned toward Europe. Inside the camp, the women slept uneasily, each haunted by letters they'd never written. The war was still raging, but within those wooden walls, a different kind of battle had begun, one for conscience, memory, and the fragile meaning of forgiveness. By December 1944, news from Europe filtered through official bulletins and whispers, reaching the camp like ghostly fragments of collapsing empires. The Allied advance had crossed the Rhine, and rumors spread that entire German cities now lay in smoldering ruins. Inside Camp Swift, the women gathered by the mess hall windows each morning, scanning headlines pinned to the notice board by American officers. They read about encircled armies, surrendered divisions, and the liberation of camps once dismissed as enemy lies. The word Buchenwald appeared for the first time, printed in stark black ink beside blurred photographs that none could forget. For Greta, the images felt like confirmation of her brother's unspoken guilt, and for Ilse, like the proof of every moral fracture she'd silently feared. The Americans, sensing the shift in morale, began permitting controlled screenings of documentary footage brought from Europe by war correspondents. On one cold evening, the projector flickered against the barracks wall, casting shadows of gaunt faces, barbed wire, and skeletal survivors stumbling toward freedom. The silence among the prisoners was absolute, pierced only by the faint hum of the film reel. A guard later recalled that several women stood at attention during the footage, as if trying to shield themselves with discipline against unbearable truth. Greta did not move. Her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white, and tears streamed silently down her face, tracing the lines of exhaustion carved by months of denial. After the screening, the prisoners filed out beneath an American flag swaying gently in the evening wind. For the first time, none looked away. The symbol they had once despised now represented a moral reality too vast to ignore. Within the camp, ideological divisions dissolved like frost under sunlight, replaced by a grim understanding that the war's true front was no longer military, but moral. The women who once called themselves soldiers now felt like witnesses standing before judgment. In that uneasy quiet, Greta whispered to Ilse, her voice barely audible, "We cannot return as we were." Ilse nodded, knowing redemption would demand more than confession. Under the Texan stars, surrounded by wire and dust, they realized that truth had no nationality, only consequence. When spring arrived in 1945, the fields around Camp Swift bloomed with wildflowers, and victory banners fluttered across Texas towns. Yet within the camp, the atmosphere was neither joyous nor triumphant. It was solemn, heavy with awareness of what the world had just survived. News of Germany's surrender reached the prisoners through a crackling loudspeaker on May 8th, the announcement echoing across the compound like a final heartbeat of a dying order. Some women wept quietly, others stood motionless, but most simply stared beyond the barbed wire toward the horizon, unsure of what awaited them beyond captivity. For Greta, the end of war was not release but reckoning. The letter from her brother had never returned, and she suspected it never would. His silence spoke louder than any confession. In the final weeks before repatriation, American officials invited select prisoners to participate in agricultural rehabilitation programs, teaching modern farming techniques and soil preservation methods. Greta and Ilse volunteered without hesitation, learning about hybrid crops, irrigation systems, and sustainable yields developed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Among those lessons, Greta found fragments of redemption, proof that creation could follow destruction. When she touched the fertile Texan soil, she remembered the cold fields of Lower Saxony, barren from neglect and war, and understood that rebuilding meant more than restoring what was lost. It meant transforming the very foundation of how a nation thought about labor, nourishment, and human worth. As the women prepared to board transport trucks bound for New York, an American sergeant handed Greta a breakfast plate: bacon, eggs, and toast, the same meal that had once broken her preconceptions. She smiled faintly before saluting him, the gesture neither military nor submissive, but profoundly human. "Danke," she said softly, placing her hand over her heart. Years later, historians would uncover records of Camp Swift's female division, their names mostly forgotten, their courage hidden beneath statistics and logistics. Yet their story survived in fragments, in letters, in testimonies, in the quiet transformation that rippled through post-war Germany's reconstruction. The bacon and eggs that once symbolized surrender became a memory of moral awakening. Beneath the endless Texan sky, enemies had rediscovered their humanity. One breakfast at a time.